Hello and welcome to the 2021 annual Percy Skuy Lecture. I'm Dr. Amanda Mahoney, the Chief Curator of the Dittrick Museum, part of the College of Arts and Sciences here at Case Western Reserve University. You'll notice that we are joined by a lovely ASL interpreter and that the talk is also auto-captioned. You can make adjustments to the captioning on your own. We also have technical support in the form of Tim Lynch. So if you have any questions regarding technical issues, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We're going to hold all questions until the end of Dr. Thompson's talk. We will use so please put your questions in the Q&A, type them into the Q&A, and I will moderate the questions. Thank you so much for joining us virtually. The practice of land acknowledgement stems from Indigenous tradition. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land and to seek to understand your place within that history. In recognizing the land upon which we reside, we express our gratitude and appreciation to those who lived, worked, learned, and healed here before us. Those whose stewardship and resilient spirit makes our residence possible on this, the traditional homeland of the Lenape, Shawnee, Wyandotte, Miami, Ottawa, Potawatomi, and other Great Lakes tribes. We also acknowledge the thousands of Native Americans who now call Northeast Ohio home. The Dittrick Museum is home to the Percy Skuy collection of contraceptive technologies, an important and fascinating historical resource. We owe the preservation of this unsurpassed collection to the visionary collector Percy Skuy. Percy not only had the foresight to collect these fascinating artifacts, but also saw their potential as historical sources. In collaboration with my predecessor, Jim Edmondson, Percy endowed the Skuy Lecture Series to ensure ongoing intellectual and research engagement with the contraceptive technologies collection. I know that you will find our speaker, Dr. Lauren MacIver Thompson, most engaging despite the virtual format. Dr. Thompson is a historian of early 20th century women's rights, medicine, law, and public health. She serves as the faculty fellow at the Georgia State University College of Law's Center for their Center for Law, Health, and Society. And this fall, Dr. Thompson will begin a new faculty position at Kennesaw State University. Her current research focuses on the intersections of medical authority and expertise, women's health, and the public health policy in the birth control and reproductive health movements. She's working on a book manuscript, Battle for Birth Control, Mary Dennett, Margaret Sanger, and the Rivalry That Shaped a Movement, forthcoming with Rutgers University Press. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Thompson.
Thank you, Dr. Mahoney, for that lovely introduction. And I also wanted to say a couple of just introductory remarks. Thank you especially to Mr. Percy Skuy, to whom we owe this lecture. And thank you to the Dittrick Museum and Case Western Reserve University for hosting me. And special thanks to my colleague Kelly O'Donnell, who put me in touch with Dr. Mahoney. And thank you to the museum staff for coordinating the details, especially Jennifer Neves. So, and also big thanks to the Cleveland Hearing and Speech Center for providing the closed captioning and the ASL interpreter. And so thank you very much for that. So before I begin, I wanted to just say a quick word about this title slide that I am sharing now, because I'm going to remain on this slide for just a few minutes. And I'm going to be discussing the three women pictured here on the slide in the first part of the talk. And so just to sort of orient you, the person on top is Margaret Sanger. The woman in the middle is socialite and philanthropist Juliette Rubley. And the woman on the bottom is Mary Ware Dennett. And so that is who I'm going to be discussing first. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and begin the talk, which is titled Doctors, Suffragists, Socialists, Eugenicists, Identities, and Politics in the Early Birth Control Movement. Mary Ware Dennett's already long and stressful day ended with being smacked by a New York socialite at a police station. It was November of 1921. Margaret Sanger and her closest friend, Juliette Rubley, had just been arrested for speaking at a birth control rally at New York City's town hall that evening. For decades, the Comstock Postal Act had made it illegal to distribute or publicize sex or birth control information, and law enforcement had turned out in full force to take Sanger and Rubley away in handcuffs. Dennett, age 49, and feeling ill, tired, and irritated with Sanger, nevertheless went to advocate for their release. Dennett was the director of the birth control reform organization, the Voluntary Parenthood League, and just a few weeks earlier had organized a town hall birth control meeting, where British advocate Mary Stopes addressed the gathering without incident. Now, Dennett's deep-seated and intensely personal commitment to free speech compelled her to defend Sanger and Rubley, even as she found herself increasingly at odds with their radical tactics. She would later write Sanger, "If our meeting on October 27th could be held free of interference, your meeting on November 13th had precisely the same right. I can be counted upon for the most complete and wholehearted moral support in defending the right of free speech for the birth control movement." So when she found herself next to Sanger in front of a crowd of reporters, Dennett waited until Sanger stopped speaking and then began trying to add in her own story about Mary Stopes and the previous October meeting. Rubley, who was standing in front of her, turned and hit Dennett in the face, snapping, "This is our affair and we don't want you in it." The slap was so hard it nearly toppled her into the crowd. Stunned, Dennett fell silent and left the station. Later, after many of their mutual acquaintances urged Sanger and Rubley to apologize to Dennett, Sanger wrote, "I am not afraid to apologize, but the more I see the acts of the person in question, the more I am inclined to believe that a sanitarium is the proper place for her." Over the course of nearly 2 decades, this would not be the first or the last time that Dennett and Sanger would come to blows, thankfully rhetorical rather than physical after this 1921 incident. But what is clear is that in the early days of the birth control movement, the two women certainly emerged as bitter adversaries who had sharply competing ideals about the role of contraception in society, as well as the methods that should be used to legalize it. Examining the conflicting agendas of Dennett and Sanger together reveals a largely untold story in the history of birth control in the United States and its place within the early 20th century women's movement. In 1915, it was Dennett who founded the first birth control organization in the United States, 6 years before Margaret Sanger would establish the American Birth Control League. Unlike Sanger, Dennett fundamentally rejected the relationship between eugenics and birth control and sought instead to legalize birth control via the rights of free speech and free expression. Although her work in the early birth control movement has been relegated to the historical sidelines, my book illustrates that it was Dennett's approach to birth control reform that pushed Sanger in new directions and forced the movement as a whole towards strategies that continue to profoundly affect today's reproductive law and policy. The project thus reinterprets the standard histories of birth control and relatedly abortion in the United States and challenges the general understanding that Margaret Sanger was the sole leader of the movement. Further, as they worked to bring birth control into the mainstream, Dennett and Sanger's politics, their feminism, their attitudes about medicine, eugenics, and race, and their approaches to reform forever shaped and cemented the way that we understand contraception in American society. So to get at these larger themes, I'm going to cover 3 central events in the history of the American birth control movement that form the core of a few different chapters in my book. The first is Dennett's unsuccessful fight with the New York Academy of Medicine beginning in 1920 to get doctors in that organization to support birth control. But even as physicians' reluctance stymied the movement, By the mid-1930s, the birth control reform movement had become firmly connected to medical expertise. Two other examples shed light on this shift. A 1936 federal court case that freed doctors from legal consequence in prescribing contraception, and a public birth control program in North Carolina run by white physicians. But before we can talk about how these three events reveal to us larger contexts, it's important to understand the place of birth control in America at the time. Birth control was illegal in the United States beginning in the 1870s. Vice reformer Anthony Comstock, who is pictured here at the top, established his New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, or the NYSSV, in 1872. And in a legal triumph against constitutional free speech, persuaded Congress to pass the Comstock Postal Act. This law banned the mailing of obscene, lewd, lascivious, or filthy material through the U.S. Postal Service, but it didn't really explicitly define what constituted obscenity. Over the ensuing decades, judicial interpretations of obscenity were dispensed with wide latitude and covered any publications dealing with sex, marriage, or birth control. Various state bills followed that copied the federal statute. First-time offenders were punished with the then enormous sum of a $5,000 fine and 5 years in prison. Both Dennett and Sanger would become targets of Comstock's zealous pursuit of obscenity and filth, both enduring trials and, for Sanger, even jail time. The cartoon that's pictured here from Life magazine on the bottom right represents Comstock's campaigns. The artist here is shown here being arrested by Comstock for painting a presumably nude woman, even though you can't see anything. And it says, "Don't you suppose I can imagine what's under the water?" So in an era before hormonal birth control, various contraceptive devices were advertised in newspapers and sold in pharmacies, but with coded language to evade the Comstock censors. In other words, obtaining syringes and douching preparations, spermicidal agents, or other forms of physical contraception without clinical or medical involvement was extremely common and normal. After all, publicly at least, most doctors denounced birth control in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and claimed that women who used contraception were violating, quote, the ethics of marriage, the laws of nature, and were endangering the very, quote, foundation of the state, the home. By the 1920s, some physicians were cautiously supporting contraception, but only if they could control its dissemination. Dr. Robert L. Dickinson, a pioneer of sterilization surgery and head of New York's Committee on Maternal Health, explained that while the work of birth control was, quote, constructive, that physicians should strive to collaborate with church and school and college in exalting marriage and monogamy. Instead of sidestepping, we will share and lead. Though he openly refuted several ideas, such as contraceptives causing promiscuity, he aimed to convince medical doctors that they should maintain ultimate control of contraceptive devices and information, which would strengthen heterosexual marriage and ultimately the state itself. You can see that from the plethora of the ads here on the PowerPoint that this campaign was not that successful. So brief biographies of Sanger and Dennett as the two central reformers in the movement are also useful here to understand how this indeed came to pass. Born in 1879, Sanger was one of 11 children. Educated at both Catholic and private boarding schools, Sanger eventually turned toward nursing training and graduated from the White Plains Hospital program outside New York City. Married in 1902 to William Sanger, she raised 3 young children and entertained some of the luminaries of socialist politics at their home. Sanger joined the Industrial Workers of the World as a strike organizer and began teaching herself about contraceptive techniques. At that time, nursing school offered almost no training in contraceptives. In the socialist movement, however, ideas about birth control and family limitation were increasingly discussed. Women who supported labor rights and socialist ideals began to agitate for more sexual freedom in society. Even as mainstream socialists were hesitant to lend their support, these women argued that without birth control, free childcare, and support for families, the working class would never be successful in improving social conditions. Socialists like Annette Conoco and others thus spoke of a class-conscious campaign for sexual enlightenment. And Sanger picked up this language as well, advocating for women's first freedom as the right to control her own body. She also began issuing essays on birth control, drawing the ire of Comstock-approved post office officials. She evaded arrest by traveling to Europe, where she visited physician experts in various birth control clinics before returning to New York in 1916. It was that same year that she opened a birth control clinic in Brownsville, located in Brooklyn, where mostly Jewish and Italian immigrant families lived. On its first day, the clinic served more than 100 women. She was arrested numerous times for operating the clinic and stood trial in January 1917. In 1921, she went on to found the American Birth Control League to further her goals. But by the mid-1920s, Sanger began to tone down some of her more overtly radical tactics in favor of wooing expert physician support for the movement. She also lobbied for what was popularly called the Doctors Only Bill. Rather than lobbying Congress to outright repeal the provision in the Comstock Act making birth control illegal, she and the American Birth Control League, or the ABCL, drew up proposed legislation that amended the law not to allow free distribution of birth control, but to allow only physicians to prescribe it. This, quote, doctors only bill firmly aligned birth control not with obscenity, but with the benefits of better public health and medical expertise. Sanger grounded this legal and moral position in the idea that an open market for contraception would hurt women and leave them at the mercy of unscrupulous contraceptive distributors whose products were ineffective or dangerous. As she later explained in her autobiography, quote, no one had sufficient knowledge of the possible consequences of some contraceptives to permit them to be manufactured or distributed without guidance or direction. They might kill the birth control movement as well as some of the women who used them. I want to highlight here that although historians and, of course, the public tend to view Sanger mostly as an activist, Sanger was, as I've mentioned, a trained nurse. So given this debate I'm discussing today, I want to suggest that we should really view her as part of the medical establishment and not necessarily separate from it. So this reconsideration of Sanger, I think, helps to really help us better understand the core of her debate with Dennett and its consequences. Sanger's position has really endured until today. Now, birth control is considered a crucial part of formal reproductive medicine obtained through a physician prescription. But as we know, the development of the birth control pill, IUDs, and other hormonal treatments for controlling reproduction have often problematic stories in the larger narrative of the history of women's health and minority health in the United States. The racist and colonialist history of running the first birth control trials in Puerto Rico, the protest in the 1960s and 1970s by the feminist women's health movement against patriarchal medicine, and the related congressional pill hearings in 1970, to name just a few examples, speak to the complicated history of the collisions between race, gender, medicine, and public health in the late 20th century. We can trace much of this backstory, I argue, to the medical and legal politics of the birth control movement in the 1920s, and the process by which birth control became part of the medical establishment. Further, this history becomes especially salient when we consider how, in the early days of the movement, it seemed possible for a moment that contraception would be viewed not through a medicalized lens, but through a civil liberties lens. In fact, the woman that I started this talk with today, a reformer whose name has been largely written out of the history of the American birth control movement, advocated for this approach, and her name was Mary Ware Dennett. Dennett's emphasis on framing birth control as, quote, free speech was certainly in keeping with a general expansion in American civil liberties reform in this period, and I can talk more about that in the Q&A. But decoupling birth control from radicalism and connecting it to medical expertise would be the key to its success in the coming decades. So she was wary of the consequences of this change. She argued that physician control of contraception constituted a medical monopoly, where paternalistic physicians would have the sole power to decide who deserved birth control and who didn't. She advocated that approaching birth control legalization as a right of free speech and free information instead would foster an open market wherein individuals and families could privately decide what was best without government or medical interference. Her approach offers us an interesting what if in understanding the framings around our current reproductive politics. Had the mainstream followed Dennett's preferred path instead of Sanger's, where would we be today? But the American suffrage and birth control movements almost lost Dennett before they even knew her. Born in April of 1872, Dennett originally wanted to be an artist. Her training and talent lay in fine leatherwork, and she was a well-known member of the arts and crafts movement. Her marriage to fellow design enthusiast and Boston architect Hartley Dennett in 1900 began as a model, personal, and professional partnership. Soon, Dennett was pregnant with their first son, Carlton, who was born after an arduous labor that nearly killed her. In 1903, she gave birth to another son, Appleton, who died after only 3 weeks, and finally bore another son in 1905, Devon, who survived. After the third pregnancy, Dennett was severely ill for 2 years from an internal vaginal tear that would require surgery. Throughout her pregnancies and after Devon's birth, physicians told Dennett to avoid sexual activity completely. But as usual for the era, they refused to give any advice whatsoever about birth control methods. Dennett would later write to friend and fellow birth control advocate Mary Stopes, quote, "I was utterly ignorant of the control of conception, as was my husband also. We had never had anything like normal relations, having approximated almost complete abstinence in the endeavor to space our babies, both wanted, but both accidental." Dennett would later partially implicate the lack of available and legal contraceptive knowledge for both her own illness and her ensuing marital troubles. After Devon's birth, her relationship with Hartley deteriorated significantly, and his unrepentant romantic interest in one of his female clients would ultimately tear the couple apart. Their 1913 divorce would be laid bare in a sensational trial, with every mortifying detail recounted in papers like the Detroit Journal and the Boston Globe. These experiences left her with little patience for male chauvinism, either in husbands or in doctors. As her marriage disintegrated, Dennett relocated to New York City with her sons and threw herself into suffrage reform, serving as literature coordinator for the National American Woman Suffrage Association, NAWSA, until 1915. She also joined Heterodoxy, a club for women interested in radical causes whose differing profession and points of view were united only by, quote, the attitude of mind called feminism. Like Sanger, Dennett too was interested in socialist ideals, which at their core promoted the idea that women would be fully emancipated in a more just and equitable world. Indeed, it was at a heterodoxy luncheon that she first heard both socialist Emma Goldman and Margaret Sanger speak on birth control. In an era of violently crushed strikes, unfettered capitalism, and almost no rights for workers, remember this is the era of the Triangle Fire that killed mostly immigrant women and girls, socialism promised to ameliorate economic and political inequalities. Soon after, while Sanger faced obscenity charges over her newspaper, The Woman Rebel, and fled to England, Dennett moved to action. On March 31st, 1915, she, along with friends Clara Gruening-Stillman and Jessie Ashley, formed the National Birth Control League at Stillman's home in New York City. From the start, the NBCL insisted that doctors had a responsibility to their patients to give them proper contraceptive information based on science, and that only the law prevented them from doing so. It also emphasized that parents should be the one to decide whether to use birth control without interference. An early NBCL pamphlet, and by the way, they changed their name to the Voluntary Parenthood League, so that's what you're seeing on the screen, the VPL. An early league pamphlet stated, "We believe that the question as to whether or not and when a woman should have a child is not a question for physicians to decide, except when the woman's life is endangered, but a question for the individual family concerned to decide." The NBCL, or the VPL, also alleged that enlightened, rational, expert doctors championed birth control, and only poorly educated, badly skilled doctors did not. Several years after the founding of the NBCL, or the VPL, Dennett's worst fears about the medical establishment were realized when, between 1920 and 1921, she attempted to court the New York Academy of Medicine's member physicians for support of a straight repeal of birth control from the Comstock Act. Dennett knew that there would be little chance that she could make any legal headway without the support of physicians, but the encounter seemed inauspicious from the start. In March of 1920, Dennett attended a meeting of the Academy's Public Health Committee, where she had a 15-minute hearing to explain her case. 5 of these minutes were absorbed by the committee chairman's railing against the cause of birth control, yet Dennett pressed onward and sent literature afterwards to committee members. But by April 6th, a subcommittee consisting of 5 physicians had countered with their own suggestion for amending the Comstock Law, writing to the VPL that they did not approve of the amendment as written and would only recommend a set of phrases that would amend the law to say that, quote, nothing in the obscenity law shall apply to duly licensed physicians in connection with the discharge of their respective duties in protecting the health of patients and of the community. In other words, birth control was to remain obscene for everyone else except doctors, just as Sanger had been advocating. Dennett tried to get the larger committee to reconsider. She wrote to them that she understood the doctor's position in wanting to preserve the public from unsafe or harmful contraceptive methods, but that a doctor's only rule made little practical sense from a public health standpoint while legal restrictions still existed. The first step, she insisted, must be to remove birth control from the obscenity clause. The doctor's bill would simply continue to associate birth control with indecent sex rather than a practicality and a social necessity. Throughout the summer of 1920, Dennett worked to earn broad physician support for birth control reform. She even began planning a conference to be held in November on birth control at New York's Colony Club, inviting 17 physicians to attend. She was as conciliatory as possible, trying to appeal to the physician's sense of public importance and expertise. Yet her correspondence with Academy members reveals an increasingly intractable disagreement over the proposed amendment, as well as a deep reluctance by many to be associated with the VPL at all. Some went so far as to accuse Dennett of using their names without their permission, which she vehemently denied. Memos circulated among NYAM members that the, quote, statements printed and verbal of the Voluntary Parenthood League are inaccurate, misleading, or false, and warned that physicians had a moral duty to prevent regular people from obtaining contraception for reasons, quote, unrelated to health. By January 1921, these machinations had pushed Dennett to the point of giving up. In a report sent to VPL supporters, she called these events, quote, an uncomfortable episode, and stated that the physicians on the Academy Health Committee had, quote, substituted a persistent misinterpretation of my letters, and they were, quote, reading into my statements ideas which were not there. Dennett's unsuccessful fight with the Academy in 1920 to 1921 illustrates the first step in how medical power and professionalization came to control birth control's narrative strategy in the coming years. Indeed, Margaret Sanger, who openly supported physicians like the ones in the New York Academy of Medicine and their insistence on a doctors-only bill, took control of the movement by aligning birth control not only with medicine, but also the science of eugenics. Eugenics, first proposed in the 1870s, was a scientific theory related to Darwinism and natural selection, which posited that humans, like animals, could be bred for better health. By the early 20th century, it was a science taken very seriously at research centers, universities, and by important leaders, and had developed into a highly organized movement. So, for example, physicians like Victor Vaughan, Dean of the University of Michigan Medical School, William Welch at Johns Hopkins, and Charles Mayo were just a few of the national prominent physicians who supported eugenics as science and who saw sterilization as a valid option. Eugenics was taught in biology classrooms and seemed to justify everything from generally improving health and environmental conditions to defending sterilization and euthanasia of the disabled or unfit. The ABCL and Sanger's magazine, The Birth Control Review, published monthly essays on the benefits of legalizing contraception in order to control the birth of the unfit, and featured guest essays on sterilization and eugenic law. While interested in eugenics, like many in her generation, Dennett, unlike Sanger, was wary of linking birth control and eugenic thinking. She told one correspondent that the two issues, quote, were almost entirely separate, not to be jumbled as two quite different considerations. They are far from synonymous. She advised another correspondent who asked her to review a manuscript on eugenics to remove his arguments about, quote, the control of the unfit, as if it were simple birth control problems, when they actually have to do with sterilization and segregation and various forms of governmental functioning by which the freedom of the individual is curtailed for the good of society. When she wrote this letter in 1928, Dennett was lobbying Congress for repeal of the Comstock Law, not setting up clinics or wooing eugenicists. Meanwhile, Sanger had been successful in transforming the movement to focus on the rapid establishment of clinics and contraceptive research. But it's important to note that neither Sanger's embrace of eugenic thinking nor the proliferation of new and shiny birth control clinics would be the key to convincing either physicians or eugenic experts that birth control should be legal. First, eugenics and birth control were not synonymous, as Dennett indicated in the 1920s and 1930s. The eugenics movement had the backing of universities and scientific agendas, and it was part of a national conversation about health and the future of American power and national superiority. Birth control, by contrast, was still publicly controversial and smacked of sex and immorality, and few eugenicists would have recognized Sanger as one of their own. By being connected with eugenics, birth control stood to gain legitimacy, while being connected with birth control threatened the prestige of the eugenics movement. As for clinics, it is true that clinics certainly did much of the hard work of distributing birth control on the ground, especially to low-income women, fitting them for pessaries and diaphragms, or providing low-cost solutions that didn't require a pelvic exam, such as spermicidal foam or jellies. The raids on birth control clinics happened because they distributed information in person instead of through the mail, as the Comstock laws focused on. They could most of the time run relatively freely. Nevertheless, many physicians and the American public frequently viewed clinics as suspect. Accusations were rife that they were run by lay people who knew nothing about medicine, or at best, incompetent doctors who otherwise could not succeed in private practice. To many, clinics were quite simply places where promiscuous women could illicitly seek techniques to have sex without any consequence, just like men. There were even accusations that these clinics were merely a front for providing illegal abortions, although clinic records suggest that this was extremely rare, and when it did happen, it was for therapeutic reasons. Private physicians certainly did not hide their disdain for clinics, many of which were independently run. The New York Academy of Medicine's Committee on Public Health Relations recommended in a report that it was not clinics, but professional physicians who should really be the ones to, quote, assume leadership in the recognition of medically indicated contraception in their offices, in hospital clinics, and only when on the basis of thorough medical study, they are professionally and morally satisfied that such an action is justified. Indeed, birth control reform made the most headway nationally when white male physicians touted their need to exercise their professional expertise without fear of legal consequence. Their cause gained an enormous boost in 1936 when United States v. One package of Japanese pessaries was heard in a U.S. district court. The one package affair was, from the beginning, a test of the constitutionality of the 1873 Comstock Act, as well as the more recent 1930 Tariff Act, both of which specifically banned the importation, sale, or distribution of contraceptive information and devices. Technically, there had been other cases prior to this where doctors that decided that doctors and druggists were free to traffic in birth control devices, but they didn't ever define what legitimate use was in a way that one package would. And these cases were ones like Young's Rubber Corporation and Davis v. United States. So Sanger and the civil liberties attorney Morris Ernst, who's pictured here and who had defended her in the past during her clinic arrests, realized that in order to garner the medical profession's official endorsement of birth control, that they would have to work to remove its association with obscenity and immorality and instead connect it to medical expertise. A court case would hasten this transformation. Sanger informed her readers of the Birth Control Review this way, quote, "While clinics are multiplying and state leagues functioning, restrictive laws still exist and block the progress of the movement. The federal laws governing the mail, common carriers, and importation still class birth control with obscenity. They conflict with state laws, confuse physicians, and hamper medical research," end quote. On December 7th, 1936, Judge August Hand upheld the decision of the lower court that had heard the one package case, arguing that the Comstock Act's design was not to prevent the full medical practice of, quote, "conscientious and competent physicians." Morris Ernst later noted that the opinion made no restrictions on the circumstances in which, quote, "a doctor was free to prescribe a contraceptive." The inference was clear that the medical profession was to be the sole judge of the propriety of a prescription in a given case, and the legality of his action was not to be questioned, end quote. The one package decision thus appeared to be a total victory for Sanger and her supporters. Trumpeting it as the law of the land, the Birth Control Review noted, quote, "Spread the word to physicians, nurses, hospitals, social workers, mothers in your community. A new era of Planned Parenthood has begun." Indeed, 1 year later, the American Medical Association, long reticent about officially endorsing birth control, took to heart Ernst's insistence that the one package case was nothing less than, quote, "the medical profession's Bill of Rights in the field of contraceptive medicine." And they endorsed a variety of measures surrounding physicians' legal rights to prescribe contraceptives. Significantly, they called for medical school education to include a thorough review of contraceptive instruction and to investigate new materials, devices, and methods for the prevention of conception. And I should note here that not all physicians within the AMA agreed with this endorsement. Dr. W.C. Woodward, the director of the Bureau of Legal Medicine, warned the weight that other courts will give this decision is purely speculative. Certainly, it is not a Bill of Rights for the medical profession. In the wake of the one package decision, doctors more freely prescribed contraceptives to their private patients, though. Reproductive health specialist Alan Guttmacher, while at Johns Hopkins, who's pictured here, conducted a national study in 1947, so basically a decade later, of 15,000 physicians, including all the licensed practicing OBGYNs in the United States. Of the some 3,300 returned and completed surveys, Guttmacher's study found that 68% of physicians approved of contraceptive advice being given to any married woman who requested it, and that fewer than 2.5% disapproved of contraception regardless of cause. 51% of the respondents reported prescribing contraceptives, quote, "frequently," and another 32% occasionally. The one package decision helped to medicalize contraception, and it was done under the auspices of Sanger and other reformers' consistent efforts to hammer away at the Comstock laws, not via legislative change or from the perspective of free speech, but from the angle of privacy and medical expertise. Other scholars have noted that it's unfair to characterize Sanger's efforts as simply deferring to medical authority. She protested, in general, the efforts of physicians to tighten indications for contraception, and she objected to their attempts to dominate clinic administration. Moreover, she and other reformers understood that it was mostly white, middle and upper class women who could afford a visit and a birth control prescription from a private physician. Low-income patients were more likely to use clinics, some of which were operated by the American Birth Control League, which would later become the Planned Parenthood Federation of America, or PPFA, while others were run by charities, hospitals, or other public health departments. Of course, Guttmacher's study does not tell us about these women who were denied birth control by their private physicians based on moral and paternalistic judgments. Additionally, public clinics too often imposed inconsistent standards for low-income or indigent patients based on moral understandings of poverty and vice. Many would only accept patients if they had been referred by other physicians, ministers, or social service agencies, and only accepted married women. So unmarried poor women or married women without children were frequently denied clinic services. One public birth control program established in North Carolina in 1938 illustrates how the forces of racial discrimination, paternalism, and medicine came to operate in the movement. Speaking to Dennett's fears of what would happen if and when physician paternalism and race-based and eugenic thinking were birth control's primary motivators. Dr. Clarence J. Gamble, heir to the Procter & Gamble fortune and a Harvard Medical School graduate, established the North Carolina program. In this case, the program was almost entirely developed and run because one white male physician had the power to do so. A firm eugenicist, he believed that sterilization and applying contraceptive programming in undesirable populations was the key to improving the race. In 1937, he worked with North Carolina health officials to personally fund and administer for an entire year the distribution and testing of a foam powder contraceptive that he had personally developed. He argued that it could be distributed cheaply and easily, and ironically touted that it didn't have to be dispensed by physicians at all, not even necessarily requiring a clinic visit, although setting up local clinics was also part of the program. He was especially proud of the impact his program could have on the state's poor African-American population, encouraging them to have fewer babies. He noted, quote, "Decrease in population is not a thing to be worried about, but decrease in the more intelligent levels of the population is, and it is my belief that contraception as a public health measure will tend to correct the present unfortunate differential birth rate." He and others also believed that Blacks could only use the simplest contraceptives because they lacked the intelligence or interest to seek out birth control, and that it must be administered to them in the clearest and most directive way possible. So this next slide, the back of this photograph, that I found in his papers indicates this kind of attitude. It says, a family living in Wake County, North Carolina, 15 children, 12 living, 3 dead, 2-room shack, welfare case. His attitude is very clear to exactly what he thought of people like this. Ironically, though, the foam powder didn't work. Both clinic field workers and patients protested once its inefficacy became clear. Further, Gamble, as planned, withdrew his funding in 1940, and contraceptive distribution and clinic operation continued on a county-by-county basis, depending only on local officials. But the existence of the program illustrates just how much had changed since Dennett battled the physicians of the New York Academy of Medicine almost 20 years earlier. White physicians had wrested control of the movement and put birth control in the domain of medicine. In general, by this period, men were dominating birth control reform, to the point where women who had started the movement were deliberately excluded from new initiatives, except as lower-level functionaries or nurses. Indeed, Dr. George Cooper, state director of the North Carolina Division of Maternity and Infancy, was explicit that the program had nothing to do with Margaret Sanger. He explained, and I love this quote, "She didn't have a dad-blamed thing to do with it, and we don't want any part of Margaret Sanger's advertising and controversy." At the national level, men were being hired to head birth control organizations, and only male doctors were being considered for medical director positions. The North Carolina program was also a harbinger of the future trajectory of birth control programming in the 1940s and 1950s, especially among communities of color. Within a few years, the ABCL, now renamed Planned Parenthood, launched a contraceptive campaign titled Better Health for 13 Million, aimed at African Americans. But patients who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of the program were at the mercy of white reformers and physicians who, as Johanna Schoen has observed, quote, repeatedly changed their minds about these services and terminated financial support for a variety of reasons. Although Black doctors and health professionals sought to lead this program, white leaders at Planned Parenthood and white physicians did not invest appropriate resources into making it a truly biracial coalition, although they were better than other organizations, including the still segregated American Medical Association. And Black patients, while certainly not uninterested in birth control, rightly distrusted a white-led medical establishment where they encountered racist and paternalist attitudes. Some Black leaders like Angela Grimke Weld worked with Margaret Sanger to publicize birth control methods in the Black community. And as early as 1918, the Women's Political Association of Harlem began scheduling lectures on the need for birth control. So you can see here on the slide that this, for example, this Black Women's Club was holding a debate about it in 1932, as was a Black church. Black newspaper editors wrote editorials supportive of legalizing birth control because they saw it as allowing for improvements in Black women's lives. So for Black birth control reformers, their support was necessarily intersectional, in that birth control could be used as a tool to mitigate the impacts of a racist and exclusionary society. But ultimately, as I expand upon in the book, the reality was that separate birth control programming for African American communities further marginalized them and made their reproductive health care a secondary cause. So to conclude, we continue to feel the ramifications of these historical choices and trajectories in the United States. We struggle to define birth control and relatedly abortion as sound medical practice. Healthcare in minority communities continues to be marginalized, and African American maternal health is at a crisis point. Birth control funding and programming at the federal and state levels is at the whim of political agendas that continue to employ moral framings about race and class. Even Planned Parenthood, in its modern iteration, has grappled recently with whether the organization needs to adopt a strictly medical framing or a more radical feminist framing, as the ousting a few years ago now of former President Lena Wen, herself a physician, illustrates. Understanding the early history of the birth control movement and why the two women at its forefront, Margaret Sanger and Mary Dennett, made the choices that they did, and what followed afterward as a result of those choices, offers us food for thought and a better path forward as we struggle to define the future of reproductive politics in our own time. Thank you very much for hosting me today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thompson. What a wonderful talk. I wish very much that we could be having this conversation surrounded by the Skuy collection and have some objects to share with you and the audience. I want to thank you again for doing this talk over Zoom. I know firsthand that it can be awkward, a little challenging. So I'm going to start off with a couple of questions that were sent ahead of time. The first one I think will be a good way to get started. Can you talk briefly about the difference between family planning and birth control, and if and when one term started to take over the other?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. We begin to see that usage of both the phrasing family planning and Planned Parenthood as we shift into the late 1930s, 1940s. And that was a very deliberate choice on behalf of the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. You've seen that we see those phrases before, but they really get their start by the 1940s. And it's, the whole idea that, especially after World War II, where returning servicemen are coming home, and there's this intense emphasis on ensuring that American families, remain the bedrock of the state in the aftermath of war and under the threat of communism. And so you really get this shift in the language and the rhetoric of birth control, that this is, family planning is how we will maintain the strength and health of the state. Margaret Sanger coined the term birth control in the early 1920s. But you begin to, you can see how, as she's fighting to, gain legitimacy for the movement, that there are other ways that other reformers wanted her to express what contraception actually was. And Dennett, I think, picks up on this too. And in the very fact that she names or she renames her organization away from the National Birth Control League, the NBCL, and she renames it the Voluntary Parenthood League. I mean, that really, I think, speaks to the beginnings of that shift, 20 years before the term Planned Parenthood comes into usage. And of course, you also see the term family limitation, and that had been around for a long time. But there's really, I think PPFA by the 40s and 50s is really thinking about that term in a new way, and really looking at it in terms of certainly nothing to do with feminism and everything to do with families and the strength of maintaining the nuclear family.
Thank you. We have two questions that are, I think, about perception or framing or the casting of Sanger and of Dennett into certain molds or roles, or how we perceive them. So one comment was that it seemed like Dennett in particular was living in a what we would now call a social bubble, an urban elitist, and maybe a socialist and progressive. Mm-hmm. That may have limited or shaped her views. Do you want to comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. I mean, I think you can make the argument that she's certainly coming from this kind of like privileged Boston Brahmin background. She was from an old Boston family. And at the same time, though, she was like a vital part of this arts and crafts movement. And, when she moved in, and then when she moves to New York, she's palling around with some of the most like radical folks of the day. And she was very open to listening to all of those ideas and changing her mind about things. At the same time, she was a big adherent of the law. She does charge Sanger with quote unquote radicalism. And she says, this is not the way that you're going to get your point across. You're not going to legalize birth control if you continue on with these radical tactics and keep getting arrested. Instead, we need to sort of approach this in some ways like how the white suffragists did. And we need to lobby, and we need to be repealing the birth control from the Comstock obscenity clause. And so it's interesting because she kind of goes about things in a multitude of ways. Her approaches were rather complicated, to be perfectly frank. So yeah, I think we can say, yes, she is certainly part of this sort of like white philanthropist socialite bubble that was very active in cities like New York. And she, of course, was a vital part of the suffragist movement. She was working with Alice Paul and all of those folks, as early as 1913, when they were putting on the suffrage parade in Washington, D.C. and so forth. At the same time, Dennett had, I think, we can characterize some of her views as differing from some of those other white women that she palled around with. Certainly in her writings, she shied away from, as I said, embracing eugenics or embracing any sort of racism. And it's not to say that she never did that. She did. But she would sort of reckon that, in her letters and things, you can tell that she's very much thinking about these things. And she's, corresponding with Black leaders and thinking about their perspectives as well. So yes, in some ways, very much product of, all of those things that made white society in this period, but also pushing back against that society.
Thank you. One of the things that I like so much about your work is that you acknowledge that historians are limited to the documents, the primary sources that survive. And so often the papers, the documents that we have to work with that have been preserved and survived are from people like Dennett and Sanger and Gamble. Mm-hmm. And something I really admire about your work is how you still get to individual people, and in this case, individual women who either received care at clinics or were denied them and were affected by all of these national level decisions and laws. So we have a couple of questions about Sanger's relationship to eugenics, and the recent, or somewhat recent, not so recent if you're a historian, it's not really news that Sanger tied herself to the eugenics movement and had some very racist views. But I wonder if you could talk more about defining her relation, reiterate what you already said about what her relationship was with the eugenics movement, and what your response is to this recent, what are the ramifications of recent criticisms and I believe one attendee put it, attacks on Sanger as a racist eugenicist.
Yeah, I mean, I think the consensus amongst my historian of medicine colleagues, I mean, we've had this conversation a lot about what does Sanger mean now. And I think that, in my opinion, we need to kind of let go of this idea that Sanger has to be the heroine of the movement. And we need to acknowledge that her adherence to eugenics and her insistence on trying to align herself with racist and eugenic framings in order to advance the birth control movement. Certainly, it was a choice that she made at that time, but that was not a choice that, for example, Mary Dennett made. So she had a choice, and she chose to do that. And as I discussed, it was a successful way to advance the legalization of birth control because it aligned with what many white Americans thought that birth control should be for, and particularly in the medical community, and physicians who saw themselves as the arbiters of national health. So, both things can be true at once. Sanger advocated for women's rights, bodily rights. She advocated for the right of women to control their own bodies. And yet she also employed racist eugenic arguments to get what she wanted. And she, you can see this in her papers when you read through the voluminous correspondence, I mean, with everybody you can think of, doctors, eugenicists, leaders in the African-American community, philanthropists. And I mean, she's just writing and writing and writing to anybody and everybody and saying whatever can be said in that moment to get their support. She was very single-minded. And so to grapple with Sanger's legacy today is something that is really crucial for the reproductive justice movement to move forward. And I actually think that organizations like Planned Parenthood, which occupies so much of our kind of the space, that's what Americans sort of think of when they think about birth control and abortion. They'll think about Planned Parenthood. And I think that they have actually done a pretty good job recently in trying to grapple with this. The removal of Sanger's name, for example, from the clinic in New York. I think that was the right move. That was the right move because we cannot have a nuanced conversation about this stuff if we insist on putting Sanger on a pedestal and ignoring the choices that she did make. There's always, it's similar to the monuments conversation. People say, well, they were just products of their time, or the reason white people acted like this in the past is that's just what everybody thought. But we know that Black reformers of color were constantly telling white people that they were wrong, and they were racist, and they shouldn't be doing or saying these things. And it was just a choice to ignore those voices. So, I think, like I said, both things can be true. She was an advocate for women's rights. She came from the socialist movement, which advocated a very radical vision and framing for women's liberation. And she fought against male socialists who didn't want it to include that. And yet, at the same time, she aligned herself with eugenicists who wanted to sterilize and eliminate the people who they deemed unfit. And we are I think we have inherited that legacy today, and I think it's the source of many of our social issues around contraception and abortion.
What a lovely way to close our conversation this evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. It's been a pleasure.
I want to thank Dr. Thompson very much for being our Skuy lecturer this year. I'd also like to thank Percy Skuy for having the forethought to endow this lecture so that we can share this type of cutting edge and also very relevant scholarship with a wide audience. I'd also like to thank Jennifer Nieves and Laura Travis from the Dittrick staff for their help in putting this together. Timothy Lynch, our tech support, and his colleagues at UTech for helping us to pull off our first webinar. Our interpreter, Karen Schiller, thank you so much for helping us improve our accessibility. We will be posting a recording of this talk when it becomes available on our website and on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a lovely evening.